I went to seminary. I never learned how to run a church. I went to law school. Nobody taught me how to run a law firm. Let's just look at how we can figure out all this, from preaching without using notes to how to develop a clear and compelling bottom line to how do you care for your elders? How do you develop a team? Let's do all that stuff that nobody talks about so that you can be an effective shepherd, because those are the visible and invisible barriers you're going to hit as a pastor. And sometimes the answer is you need to pray more. Often it's not. The barrier isn't spiritual. The barrier is structural.
Well, Carey, what a joy to be with you today. Thanks for making time to be on this podcast.
I always love any time I get with you, Jason. So thanks so much for having me.
Carey, I had the privilege of visiting Connexus Church a few months ago. My son Hudson and I came out. Jeff Brody kindly invited us. And I saw, like, you attend that church. This is the church you planted. You still attend it. You were there that Sunday. And there's so much that I walked away having been positively impacted by Jeff's heart, by the team's heart, the excellence, the thoughtfulness. But what left the biggest mark on me was your posture as a planting pastor in the room, cheering on Jeff, meaningfully participating. And I just really want to honor you, because it's actually rare. I don't know why it's rare, but that a founding pastor could be in the church, receiving, contributing, cheering on the leadership team. And it was so special to experience that. And I just wonder, like, for you, like, how does that feel to be part of a church that you were able to start that continues to flourish and thrive, that you and your family get to participate in?
Well, the short answer is it feels fantastic. I mean, thank you for saying what you said. It feels great. I mean, since you were there just a couple of months ago, we opened up a permanent location. We'd been portable since we launched, moved into a permanent facility. And yesterday, my wife and I went to Connexus Aurelia, and we almost didn't get a seat. It was like gone. And I'm like, all right, I can watch from behind the sound booth. Or I said to my wife, I'm like, hey, we can catch us online after. Like, I don't need to muscle my way in to find a seat. And then we found a couple that were together. And so we stayed for the service. But just thrilling. I mean, to see something that you started, to know what it was like in the beginning. Because for us, Connexus has been around for 18 years. We trace it back 29 years to when I came as a seminary student to 3 declining, dying mainline churches. And we started to see life, and they went on to amalgamate, and eventually that became Connexus. So to us, it's a timeline. But to see this live beyond my leadership is a thrill. That's a short answer. The long answer is it's a process of sanctification. I mean, you have all the emotions. If you're a leader, John Mark Comer and I had a really candid conversation about this once after he left Bridgetown and attended there. And I mean, like him, he has Tyler Staton. I don't know that you could get someone a lot better than Tyler Staton or Jeff Brody to follow
pretty solid
in your footprints, like 2 super solid leaders. But you're still the leader. You're the founder. Like you have an opinion on everything. I have an opinion on absolutely everything. And so for me, for the last 9 years since I exited the role of lead pastor, has been a constant battle of, like, getting my ego out of the way, keeping my mouth shut, being privately and publicly constructive. And don't get me wrong, Jeff has not screwed up. There is nothing wrong with the way he has led Connexus. But when you're a leader, you always have thoughts and opinions on how everything goes. So it's been, a journey of sanctification for me, I hope, a journey of leadership. And now it's easy. It's very easy. But in the early days, we had a little bit of trying to negotiate what I speak into and what I don't. Jeff and I still meet every other Thursday morning, and it's his meeting. This is at his request. It's his meeting. I don't bring an agenda. Sometimes I have 1 or 2 things I want to talk to him about, but it's not like, here's how to make the church better. It's not that. It's more like, hey, here's what I'm processing. What do you think? And I'll get his take on something that I'm dealing with, but the meeting is his. And sometimes he asks me for my opinion. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he just vents, as only lead pastors can, to fellow lead pastors. And so often he'll say, I'm telling you this because you're the only person who will get it because you sat in this seat. And I'm like, dude, I get it. Like, I 100% get it. So, but that's been a long obedience in the same direction. And, the best advice I got was I had a fun moment yesterday. I was remembering Gordon MacDonald. So when I stepped right off the teaching team at the end of 2020, so I was lead pastor until 2015, then relinquished the lead role to Jeff, but by mutual agreement stayed on as the main teaching pastor. So if you sit in the back row, doesn't seem to be much of a difference, right? The guy with the microphone is still the guy with the microphone. And Jeff started to really enjoy teaching and then get very good at teaching. And I knew I was getting to the end of my run. So at the end of 2020, I stepped off staff or off the staff role as a teaching pastor. And I talked to Gordon MacDonald, Ordering Your Private World. And I said, Gordon, I called a number of mentors. And I said, hey, what do I need to learn? Like, what was your biggest lesson when you got out of day-to-day ministry to build into leaders? What did you learn stepping out of the pastorate? And he said, they forget you quickly. And he's so right. I taught twice this year, maybe once this year. And I have an open invitation, but I'm just not feeling like it's a calling in this season. And so yesterday after church, we're at the grocery store, and there's a couple ahead of us. And I went to get one last thing. And when I get back, my wife, Tony, is talking to this guy, and he looked vaguely familiar. And I thought, gosh, did our kids play sports together? Was he a doctor who worked at the hospital that Tony worked at? Turns out he's going to Connexus, and he and his wife have just joined us. They moved up from Toronto. They're living locally. And he recognized my wife because she preached 2 months ago. And I'm standing there beside her. He has no idea who I am. He doesn't care. And I'm like, great. Now my wife gets recognized and I don't. So it's just a constant lesson in humility and learning to sit in the back seat.
Well, it's pretty special. And I don't want any pastor who's doing transition to feel this pressure, like you have to stay with Joy forever. Like that just might not be in the cards. But when it happens, like what the gift is, and even just chatting with Jeff privately, the ability for you to support and cheerlead and encourage is so profound. And so thank you for that example. It was really
you're
special
welcome.
to see.
To give you a metaphor too, the church isn't private property. It's a public mission given to us by God. So this analogy is going to break down before it even comes out of my mouth. But you're a dad. I met your son. How many kids do you have, Jason? You have
3 kids.
3 kids. Okay. And they're still young. They still depend on you. Yeah. I have 2 boys. They're in their 20s and 30s now. And, what do you do as a parent of adult children? The number one answer is you cheer them on. You're happy when your kids succeed. You're happy when they're thriving. And so I see, not that the church is my kid growing up, but it's so fantastic to see it thriving and people coming to faith, and so many people I don't know. And to know, I helped build the foundation. That's great. And I made some mistakes along the way, but to see it really thrive in the next generation. And I'm sure one day when Jeff steps aside, somebody else will lead it. And I hope it's even bigger and better then.
So one thing that's pretty special, like why I'm really glad to be chatting with you, some people know this, is this particular thread now called the Pastorate, this podcast thread. Once upon a time was a thread that you initiated and started having these conversations with Canadian churches, which I think is so powerful because there's so many amazing stories of God at work in local churches across our amazing, big, diverse country. And you started sort of chronicling those stories and giving space for it. And then through a series of events, you and I ran into each other in London and had breakfast. We're both in the same city because of the Alpha Leadership Conference. And you very kindly said, hey, would this ever be a resource to you? Or is this ever something you'd use? And at the time, some friends and I, some pastors were thinking, how could we help Canadian pastors? And we kind of like did the napkin sketch of like, we could do some gatherings, we could do some programs, but we would love this at the heartbeat to be a conversation that can be spread digitally online. And so when you had that very generous offer, it really moved us from maybe we should to I think we could. And so I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for investing and being generous and helping call out a bit of potential in myself and in our group of friends that had this idea that we might have not had the courage to step forward in.
I really appreciate that, Jason. And I'm thrilled to see what you've done with it. I watched the Rebrand recently online unfold, and I thought, oh, that's cool. You're taking it to the next level. No, but this is very similar to the church. I guess, in the end, I'm going to be a guy who started a lot of things and then hand them off to the next generation. But it was a similar thing where I get a lot of ideas. And I'm still doing the leadership podcast that I do, but I started a second podcast maybe, I don't know, 7 years ago or so. And I thought, we'll call it the Canadian Church Leaders Podcast, and that'll be really cool. And so I did it for a while, and it was good, and we built something of significance. But I thought, I don't know that I'm going to keep doing this. And there were a couple of things that shifted, not really important. And to be honest, I can't remember 100%. So I kind of put it on ice. But every once in a while, you have something you realize, oh, there's some potential value there. And I forget the exact number, but I think when I had breakfast with you in London, I remember that breakfast well and will for the rest of my life. I think there were over 100,000 downloads. So that podcast feed was like legit. It was a real feed. And I'm like, I could just leave this to be nothing, or I could give it to somebody that I think could do something even better with it. And I'd thought about it and prayed about it for about 6 months. And then when we had breakfast in London, I'm thinking, I think Jason's the guy. And so that's when I made the offer. And I'm thrilled to see you take it, run with it, evolve it into something different, and to make it beautiful for our country. So that's really cool what you've done with it.
Well, thank you. I remember following up with you after that, being like, he probably wasn't serious. Like that was probably just a moment of inspired
I don't make
generosity.
fake offers. That's one thing. As you get to know me, it's like I'm very careful. But if I offer you something, I mean it, and that's just great to see it thrive.
I've heard you consistently try to answer the question: how does the church reach in a changing culture, increasingly secular, hyper digital, all these things? When it comes to making deep disciples, and I don't want to create a binary between evangelism and discipleship that's unhelpful. But on the side of the question of like, how do we pastor those in our care to build a resilient, lasting, deep faith? How might some of the changes that we're observing in culture, increased secularism, increased digital nativeness, as you're thinking about building resilient disciples, what might the church need to have in mind, particularly maybe discipling Gen Z or people who are growing up in this world?
Well, let's start with the good news. The good news is, I think one of the things that shifted a lot, even in the last decade, is, when I started ministry, people were still more open to church. They were curious about it. They were wondering, like, well, do I really go to this church or not? My parents went to church. And now we're at the point where if you're Gen Z or Gen Z and you've got spiritual questions, you're getting really serious about your faith, probably earlier rather than later. So I always felt that there were times where I was preaching to the back row, trying to convince someone who was passively there to embrace faith. And what I think has changed is if you're sitting in the back row, whether you're a boomer or whether you're a Gen Z, you are curious about faith. Otherwise, you would have left. So I think it's actually easier now once you've made connection with them. Secondly, whether it's a boomer or a Gen Z shows up at your church and they're sitting in the back row, they've already Googled their spirituality. They've already probably explored different traditions. They've checked you out online. So when you actually make contact with them, whether that's a DM on social or whether they're sitting in the back row, they're ready to go further. The other thing I would say that's really changed is if you're interested in Christianity, you're probably interested in discipleship because you don't want to do Jesus light. The way I frame it is, let's say I was thinking of converting to Islam or to Judaism. Do I want in this era a light version of Islam or a like, why am I converting then? Right? No, I don't want to be a secular Jew. I want to be an Orthodox Jew, or I want to get deep into the teachings of Islam in the same way that if I express a curiosity about Christianity, I probably want to go deeper. So somebody's first Sunday, you don't want to jump on them and hand them a 300-pound Bible and get them into a discipleship group right off the bat. Like, have some social intelligence, meet with them, connect with them where they're at, listen to their questions. That's why I love Alpha so much, is it just works. but they're probably ready for alpha sooner than they were 10 years ago. They're probably sooner for real, authentic. They're more ready earlier for real, authentic conversations. And then I really, discipleship is such an active topic in the church right now. And I don't know what the right answer for what does it mean to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus? What does it mean to be well discipled? I don't know what the ultimate answer to that is. But my working definition is 2 to 3 years after your baptism, do you look more or less like Jesus? Like, hopefully I look more like Jesus now than I did 5 years ago, than I did 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean that what happened when I was 30 was garbage. No, there was a lot of garbage that had to be removed from me still, even in ministry. But you want to be moving, you want to be molded, you want to be formed in the image of Christ. And so I think that's a genuine progress. And it's essentially making sure that people stay on the path, making sure that their lives look more like Jesus, bear more of the fruits of the Holy Spirit today than they did yesterday, and tomorrow than they did today. That's what I would think about it. I think people are more ready for that now when they connect with your church or connect with somebody in your church than they were even 10 years ago, because consumer Christianity is dead. And so if you're looking for some kind of connection with a church, you're probably ready to go deeper faster. Now, the challenge for that is a lot of our ministry models haven't updated. We think by having a great worship team and a pretty funny / killer message on Sunday, we're going to disciple people. I am not against great worship teams and I'm not against great messages, but that isn't enough. You've got to connect with people. You got to lead them personally. And, we've resurrected Alpha at our church over the last 5 years. And that has been such a life-giving bridge, just to see people who started zero spiritually and get baptized and end up following Jesus. And it changes their lives. It's amazing to see.
It really is a profound invitation in our time. Like I've been doing this for a little bit, been inviting people, neighbors, friends to Alpha for a long time. There is an openness to evaluate the real thing. Like I got a call from a friend of a friend, and she essentially said something so clear. She's like, I am thinking about becoming a Christian. I'm from this other faith. I would love to understand more deeply about Christianity. What should I do? I've never had an evangelism opportunity just handed to me, but I don't think that's just this one anomaly. There's something happening where people are going, whatever experiment we're doing culturally right now, that's not working. And so there's an openness to explore alternative paths. And then, this is our opportunity to go, well, let's shine a light on the path that we believe leads to full life. It's deeply exciting.
It is. And Jeff Brody, I mean, he's not unique in this, but he's been talking more about reaching pre-Christian people than post-Christian people. Like if you're of a certain age, you had a church to walk away from. But we're a couple of generations away from that now. And we legitimately run into people on a regular basis at Connexus who would be like, yeah, I don't know anything about Jesus. Not sure what Christianity is. Does that mean you're a good person? Like what does it mean? Or my father was Anglican. Does that mean something? Like no clue. And so you're really starting from scratch, and they don't necessarily have the hangups of previous generations. They've got that openness, that curiosity that can lead to a deeper conversation sooner.
Okay, recently, I don't know how recently, you were interviewing Malcolm Gladwell, and you asked what I think was one of the coolest interview questions ever. You said, let me see if I get this right. What question do you wish you were asked more when you're being interviewed? And I just thought that's like such a great question, from like one junior interview learning from another. I just love that. But I want to ask you that. What is something that you wish you were asked more? Like something that you're maybe excited to talk about, or wish that you had the opportunity to speak to a bit more often?
That's a great question. Give me a second to think about it, and I will give you an answer. Here's one. What are the dangers of being a pastor to your spirituality, to your faith, your personal faith?
So, Carey, what I mean, that is at the heart of this conversation, actually. We wanted to
Yeah.
create a space of how do we get honest about this pastoral vocation, what it means, but also what does it do to us? What do you think? How does it affect our spirituality and our walk with God? What
I
are the
think it's very
dangers?
dangerous. I think it's very dangerous to your spiritual health. I did not intend to become a pastor. I got called into it. I was in the middle of law school and felt a call to ministry that was confirmed, went to seminary, but was really confused by it. So the idea of being, quote, a professional Christian, being paid for what I believe, was really new to me. And I was, in ministry, depending on how you frame it, 20 to 25 years, where that is how I earned my living. And I realized early on it's just got so many layers to it. Number one, it's really easy to cheat on your Bible reading because if you're preaching on the weekend and you're preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, it's very easy to make my personal reading the Sermon on the Mount. So 3 years into ministry, I bought a 1-year Bible back when we were buying analog Bibles. Now they're back again. And started reading the 1-year Bible just as a discipline to get through the scriptures because I realized I'm lazy. I'll make my day job my personal walk. About 10 years into ministry, 15, I started asking a question: if all of this disappeared tomorrow, what would be left of my faith? Because I
Mm,
think I needed to ask that question for me. And I didn't know the answer to that question. Would I be, because there's going to be a day where we're not all paid to be on church staff.
mhm,
What would I lose my faith? Would it feel weird? It's an occupational hazard. I can say 5 to 9 years on the other side, depending on how you mark time. Uh, it's going well. If anything, it's deeper, which is
mm,
good. But then, shouldn't it have been deeper when you were in ministry? It's a great question. Another thing that's really hard for me because I'm probably a performance addict. Like I like to succeed. I like to do well. I think a lot of people who end up in ministry can probably identify with that. And so it was very easy to confuse progress in the church with progress personally. And
mm,
it was almost like when things were going well at the church, that was like an ironclad guarantee that I must be doing a good job and I must be a good human according to God. And we've been very public about it, but our marriage went through when the church was growing super fast, our marriage went through a really difficult period.
mm,
And my wife would have said, I'm not happy in this marriage. But when you're growing 30% a year and reaching all kinds of people and people are coming to faith, it's easy to think your opinion doesn't count. Look at how God is validating my life and
mm, mhm,
validating me and validating my ministry. Now, that was a short season, but that lived in my head.
mm,
And that's not true. I'm now at the point where it's like I want the people closest to me to get the best of me, not the worst of me. So to the
mm,
point when we opened up the first facility we built in 2003, Tony was on the front row crying, not tears of gratitude and emotion, but tears of bitterness, just that she felt like she lost her husband to build this full building. And I regret that. I really regret that. So I think ministry comes, the pastorate comes as an occupational hazard. And I was able to navigate those to the point where I didn't deconvert, but certainly my faith was tested and came out, I hope, stronger. And where my character got sifted and hopefully got better. But man, it's an occupational hazard.
mm. I've been thinking in the framework of what unique practices, and every person's unique. And so I don't want to generalize, but what unique practices do pastors need in their rule of life or whatever framework you say in your life architecture that will sustain you in ministry? And so I've been thinking about things like confession
Mm.
or practicing certain kinds of friendships as a spiritual discipline, like right up there with like daily prayer, and trying to build a little bit of vocabulary amongst other pastors, like, hey, this is not the same as just following Jesus. If like when you're in ministry, it affects your walk with God. So what kind of counterformative practices or preventative measures can you take? I'm curious if you mentioned a few. Anything else come to mind that you are practicing or wish you would have earlier in your journey that could have sustained that kind of deep well of God's love through that season?
I wish earlier on I would have sorted out the relational confusion that happens in ministry. Because if you really think, I want to do some more deep writing on this, like deep writing. I don't know that I do deep writing, more writing on this in the future, but a more exhaustive treatment. But if you think about ministry, everybody you meet is either someone you serve or someone you wish would join your church, right? So it's utterly confusing, from the people at the supermarket to the people at the hockey rink or ball diamond to your neighbors to the people who are actually affiliated with your church. You have some kind of, quote, relationship with every single one of them. And that means, can you have authentic friendships? It's a really great question. And we know loneliness is a growing issue. Over the last 25 years, it's become an epidemic. Arthur Brooks has a super helpful framing. He talks about real friends and deal friends. And he's so right. And I'm going to say something that probably a lot of people are going to disagree with. But most of the people that you have in your life right now, if you're on staff at a church, are deal friends, vast majority. So our church was maybe, I'm going to say 3,500 people when I stopped being the lead pastor. And I went from 3,500 people who were, quote, my friends to about 5 who were my friends, 3 to 5. And what that means is, well, it could mean I'm a loser, right? I don't think that's what that means. What that means is most of those people, the vast majority, 99%, were there because I served a role in their life. I was their pastor. Call back to Gordon MacDonald, they forget you quickly. I had a boss, he's not here anymore. Oh yeah, that guy used to own the restaurant. He doesn't run it anymore. You are that person. And you're like, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm in the hearts of everybody. No, you're that person. Okay. I'm just breaking the news to you. And it doesn't mean that they don't love you. It's just Jeff's their pastor now and I'm not. And all the new people will never know who you were. So what is a deal friend versus a real friend? A deal friend, that's why a lot of CEOs, imagine you ran a company for 30 years or worked in the corporate field or were an entrepreneur. Almost everybody who retires will tell you their phone stops ringing the moment they resign, the moment they retire. And the reason is all of those were deal friends. And sure, you did vacations together and you hung out and you went out for dinner, but you were there because they needed you. So your real friends, Arthur Brooks says, are useless but worthy. And so they're useless because they can't help you, right? Like you were useful to someone because, well, Jason's going to teach me next week, or he could do my wedding one day, or he'll do my mother's funeral, or that kind of thing, right? So you're useful. But your real friends, they're not very useful, but they're invaluable. And so I have friends like that. I was on a text chain with a couple of friends today, and this news item broke, and I said to my friend, hey, I think this could be you. You should apply. You should do this. Like, that's one instance where I'm somewhat useful. But for the most part, we just enjoy each other and we love hanging out. They happen to be Christians. I have some non-Christian friends too. And then there's a British evolutionary psychologist, Robin Dunbar, who says basically all people really have the capacity for is 3 to 5 close friendships. So the problem with ministry is you have 300, 3,000 people who you think are your friends, but you don't have anyone in that circle of 3 to 5 close friends. So when the ministry goes away, all your relationships disappear. And I'm fortunate. I worked very hard to make sure that didn't happen. It didn't happen, but that is an occupational hazard. I don't think anyone understands it. And now when I interact with people, I do hope they come to Christ and I hope they come to church, but I don't have to have that dual relationship anymore. And the people, I'm friendly with hundreds of people who remember me from Connexus. Like, there's no ill will there. On the other hand, I'm not going to their place for dinner tonight, and we're not heading out on the boat anytime soon. They're just really good friends that we had a great season with. But my real friends, that's different. The second thing I think you can do to guarantee against that, it doesn't sound like a spiritual discipline, but I would vote for it to be one, is to build a life that has nothing to do with work. In other words, what do you do when you're off the clock? And you're never off the clock as a Christian. You're never off the clock as a pastor. But what I realized when I was unhealthy and on the road to burnout and our marriage wasn't great is my entire world revolved around the church, and anything I did for God was good. So what I had to do on the other side of burnout after I burned out in 2006 was discover things like hobbies. Like, what do I do just for me, just for fun? What is it like to really be off? And that has been a decade and a half journey that has been really difficult. It comes in waves. But I remember one day I was sitting with my wife in our living room and our kids were gone. And I'm sitting there reading a book and I'm so agitated and nervous. And the sun's pouring in. It's a beautiful day. And I was kind of like, oh, I think this is what most people do with their Saturday afternoons. They just sit around and drink a cup of coffee and read a book. Like, I didn't have a category for that. I'm like, this is what normal people do. Or they put on the TV just to relax. Well, I didn't do that. And I paid a price. I think arguably the church paid a price when you have an unbalanced leader. And I know my family paid a price. So it would be the discipline of, what do you do just for you?
Carey, one of the things I've also really appreciated about how you've communicated and the topics you've addressed is you dive into things like preaching. Your stuff on preaching recently has just been amazing, by the way. I've really appreciated it. We'll post in the description below a link to an article I read in preparation for this that just is so helpful. But the other things you've spoken to are things like fundraising, personal leadership, organization. And I think we read the Bible as pastors and we think about the shepherd. And then we look at board governance, fundraising, these things. We're like, well, that doesn't sound spiritual. But it's like shepherding was obviously an administrative task as well. And I feel like there's like this dichotomy where I'll be with young pastors, and myself included, where it's like, oh, we have to do a board meeting. Oh, I have to do a campaign. And it's like, we want to put that as non-spiritual and important, but that's not what I signed up for. I just see you as somebody who's integrated the vision of a leader, shepherd, to involve all of that. Any reflections to pastors who generally approach fundraising, governance, board as kind of like a necessary evil they have to do? How do we bring that into a cohesive vision of a robust vision of a shepherd leader?
So I agree with the assumption under your question. And I would say, I think what we're seeing right now is a reaction to boomer-led spirituality. And if you go back to the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, what did you have? The pastor's basically a CEO and you've got to figure this out. Now, if you really want to dissect that, I'm giving a bit of a history lesson here. One of the reasons I think that, and that's pre-me, I wasn't in ministry at that time, but that was the cereal I ate for breakfast, right? Because that's who was leading the church when I was coming up. And I think one of the reasons they got so interested in that, Gordon MacDonald, to quote him twice in this show, told me that in the 1970s, when he was leading Grace Chapel, he was one of a handful of churches over 1,000 attenders. Like, Spurgeon's church wasn't that big. And you look over the history of churches, organizationally, you had generally very small churches, 100, 200 people. Sometimes you have a church of 500. But churches that started becoming in the thousands really emerged, not even at scale, but they were starting to become more common in the 1970s. And then you have a group of people, leaders in the 70s and 80s, whose parents had led small churches. And now they have to figure out what happens when 1,000 people show up. And the suburbs happened and the automobile happened and, people had choices and there was broadcasting. And so ministries really started to grow. So they were figuring that out. And then they kind of got the language of, oh, this is like, companies have to deal with this. And, organizations have to deal with this. We can learn from Motorola. We can learn from Nokia. We can learn from all these 90s companies. We can learn from Kodak, many of whom aren't even in existence anymore. So that's why I think you got it. And then my generation, Gen X, comes along. We sort of straddle the middle. Your generation comes along and it's like, no, we're shepherds. We're not CEOs. On the other hand, you've got these organizations that you are led to run. And if you go right back to, if you kind of love language, corporation is Latin for body, corpse, right? And the church is a body, not a corpse. It's a body. I think it's Latin, might be Greek. But anyway, and so you look at that. Acts 2 doesn't happen without Acts 6. It's not sustained without Acts 6. So Acts 2, everybody's into Acts 2 and Acts 4, and the church is growing daily and so on. And by Acts 6, you've got a crisis. It's like the apostles are pulled in a million different directions and they don't know what to do. It's like, well, we have to appoint some people who are godly to look over the admin, to look over basically the first executive pastors and associate pastors. It's like, you guys deal with the food, okay? And we'll go pray and we'll read the Bible. But structure is spiritual. It really is. And then Paul has to figure out governance in the early church, and it wasn't easy, right? So we're going to appoint elders in Ephesus and Galatia and beyond, and I'll go visit the Roman church, and they had to figure all this stuff out. So I think the allergy you see to it now is a reaction against boomer and elder spirituality. And I think, yeah, the church is not a corporation. On the other hand, the number Warren George and Carl Bird has shown this, I think, quite convincingly in how to break church growth barriers. The reason 85% of churches never make it past 200. Think about growing churches that are just stuck, like you have new people every week, but you just can't break that 200, 250 barrier. What is that? They argue it's you haven't scaled pastoral care. And I think they're right. That's not a spiritual thing. It's not like people stopped coming or they stopped being converted. But if I'm looking to you to visit me every time I'm sick or every time someone's in the hospital, if I'm looking to you as my pastor, Jason, to do every wedding and every funeral and every special occasion, and didn't you know my parents had their 50th and you didn't show up, and what's wrong with you? We're leaving the church. That's what's going on at 200 people. It doesn't scale. And you can study this from a spiritual perspective. Robin Dunbar makes the same argument. That happened to corporations. So what do? You have to figure out how to let the congregation care for the congregation. Once you do that, you can grow past 200. Then at 400, it's governance. Then at 800, it's senior leadership. Then beyond 1,000, it's clear and compelling vision and preaching. There are very predictable, and that's one of the reasons I do what I do is people keep running into these lids, and I'm like, look, I went to seminary. I never learned how to run a church. I went to law school. Nobody taught me how to run a law firm. Let's just look at how we can figure out all this, from preaching without using notes to how to develop a clear and compelling bottom line to how do you care for your elders? How do you develop a team? Let's do all that stuff that nobody talks about so that you can be an effective shepherd. That's what motivates me. And to me, the whole thing is there because those are the visible and invisible barriers you're going to hit as a pastor when you can't figure out why isn't this working. And sometimes the answer is you need to pray more. Often it's not. The barrier isn't spiritual. The barrier is structural.
I really appreciate you sharing that. Here's the last question, Carey. What, as you look at the church, you can go global, you can go national, you pick your geographic lens. What's giving you the most hope these days? What's exciting you? What's inspiring you when you look at you go, this is a sign of something beautiful happening?
I love what I'm seeing in England, actually. That's where my mind went initially. And I think it could be a model for Canada. And you've seen it too, Jason, so I'm sure have a lot of your listeners. But you go into these 100, 300, 400-year-old churches that kind of look like cathedrals, at least to a Canadian eye. And they're being reborn a lot through the work of Holy Trinity Brompton and the Alpha Network. But you see new generations, you see people in these old spaces. And what's happened to Canada is there's a lot of buildings with no people. So you think about all the churches that have an endowment fund, an investment fund. So they have buildings, but they don't have any people. And then you have church plants that have people, but no buildings and no money. Wouldn't it be cool if there was some kind of swap in our country where the churches with buildings and money said to the church planters with people and no money and no buildings, hey, can we work together? And you see that happening like crazy in America. You see that happening like crazy in England, and you see it in other places of the world. And in Canada, it's like, yeah, we're not going to do that. I would love to see that change. The hope in that is it's happening around the world. And the hope is we do have not enough, but we have a fledgling next generation of leaders ready to take on leadership in the church, waiting for my generation and older to hand over the keys, to give them podcast feeds, to say it's your turn to be the lead pastor, to do things like that. Like if you're an older Gen X or a boomer or an elder listening, hey, time to hand over the keys, or at least look at really getting the next generation into leadership. Not a seat at the table. Yes, definitely that. But a voice at the table and a vote at the table, and get them ready to lead. And then if you've got the keys to an empty building and a deed, look at changing your policy and handing them over to church planters. Most of them are non-denominational. That's okay. It's one kingdom. That's the hope. And that's the end of my rant.
Well, Carey, I'm very thankful for you for a lot of reasons. I'm thankful for all that you share. You're so generous with your podcast and with your blog and all the other ways that you shape content that equips pastors and leaders. And you've been generous to spend this time with us today. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for making time to be with us.
Hey, it's been great. Jason, thank you so much.